The creaking steps are back. I really should ask Mr. Richards about that. I'm starting to think one of the children tends to wander at night, though I haven't a clue why they would venture into the attic. January 27th, 1922. I am so happy. I am so happy. This place is wonderful. I hope to stay here forever. I want to live here forever. I want to die here forever. I think I will. It is so beautiful. Good night.
January 28th, 1922. Report of Officer Charles Dawson. When I and the other officers had first arrived at the scene of the crime, I had not believed anything appeared amiss. But the farmhands who had alerted us were nonetheless terrified. When I asked them where Mr. Richards was, he told me to go into the barn. At first, I didn't understand. I slowly proceeded to the barn and noticed something peculiar about the farm. And that peculiarity was that everything appeared normal. The animals were well fed and taken care of, and there was smoke spewing from the home of the Richards family, where I assumed they must be. What was off, however, is why all of this appeared so normal. The farm looked like it had been kept in check, as it usually does. Yet there were the farmhands, scared out of their wits. It was for that reason instinct told me to draw my firearm as I approached the barn. The other officers did the same as they saw my gesture. It would turn out that my weapon would prove to be unnecessary, or more appropriately, it would prove to be too late. As I opened the barn door, I was greeted by a ghastly smell that was like nothing I'd ever smelled before in this small town. Initially, I could not pinpoint the origin of the stench, but as we moved deeper into the barn, we discovered the source. A grisly scene of death that I had been unfortunate enough to never have witnessed in my career until now. One of the officers under me vomited immediately. Another walked out of the barn almost as soon as he walked in, crying. Others simply turned in disgust. But I stood there, staring at the bodies. There were 2 bodies in the barn, and I knew them personally. John Richards, the owner of this farm, was a good man, and undeserving of his fate. May God rest his soul. I found him in a pile of hay, lying face down with a hole-like wound in the back of his head. I found Marjorie a few feet away, lying in the dirt, with a similar wound. Judging from how we found them, with wounds in the back of their heads, lying face first on the ground, I would assume that their murderer, or murderers, had forced them into the barn where they were then executed whilst on their knees. To see John and Marjorie like this, words cannot describe. Then I remembered that the two had children, and an unyielding fear came over me. It was at this point I pulled two of my better composed men aside and instructed them to stay at my rear and be on their guard. Together, we walked towards the family's home, and I remember an insatiable wrath in me as I knew what I was going to find. We entered through the front door, I with my weapon hanging steady in the air. I don't know if I actually believed that the perpetrator would still be present, but I know that I wanted it to be so.
You just take so much damage.
I moved past the stairway and down the hall into the kitchen.
Me doing like little damage?
There had been some crumbs left behind on a plate. I can't say for certain if the suspect had stayed for a time after the crime, or if he had interrupted the family in the middle of a meal. It should be noted, however, that there was just one plate. I had turned around from there and proceeded to check the rest of the rooms on the first floor, but found nothing out of place. There had been no sign, as far as I could tell, that anything had been taken from the home. In fact, there was a bit of money on the table that remained untouched. It would seem this was not a robbery, but rather the result of a monstrous activity with no real explanation to speak of. When I found myself back at the stairs, I and the other officers continued upward to find what I had feared, yet expected all along. Despite that, I was always at the ready to pull the trigger on my firearm. At the top of the stairs, we came upon an elongated hallway, with rooms located on each side and another set of stairs to the third floor at the end. I knew that the children's room was at the end of the hall on the left side by those doors. I could see the door from where I stood. Every other door was opened. There was a master bedroom, which appeared to have been unused, and then there were the two guest bedrooms, one of which had looked as if it were recently used. This angered me, but I don't believe that the other officers understood the sick and twisted sense of humor from the perpetrator that I saw in it. After determining that the first few rooms were safe, we moved forward towards the children's room. When I reached the door, I stood there for a moment, considering whether or not it were wise to look inside. Unfortunately, as an officer of the law, I did not truly have the luxury of that choice. But as commanding officer at the crime scene, I could save my fellow officers from having to bear witness to what I knew I was going to see. I had them return back down the stairs, and once they had all vacated the area, I continued. I put my hand on the doorknob, twisted it, and entered. I was in the room for 5 minutes, and I only got as far as 2 steps in before I could not bring myself to move anymore. I cannot and will not record in this report what I saw, nor will I ever speak of it to anyone. It was a sight that as few people as possible should have to see, let alone hear of. and I know it will haunt me for the rest of my days. When I was able to regain my composure, I backed out of the room and shut the door. I made sure the other officers were still out of sight. If I became lucky enough to find the scum of God's beautiful earth that did this, then I wanted to be the one to send him back to hell from where he came. I proceeded up to the 3rd floor. Here, there were only 2 more rooms and a ceiling door to the attic. The room on the right appeared to be used for storage, and the room on the left contained another gruesome sight that I admittedly didn't expect to see. It was the maid's room, and she was still present. She laid with her head down at her